This is Principles of Ecosystem Ecology. Chapter 7. Decomposition in Ecosystem Carbon Budgets. In the previous chapters, we examined the input of carbon to ecosystems and its allocation in plant carbon budgets. Here, we examine the loss of carbon from ecosystems that results from microbial decomposition. Decomposition is the physical and chemical breakdown of detritus, that is, dead plant and animal microbial material. If decomposition didn't occur, organic matter would quickly accumulate. And there's a whole host of species that works off the energy and nutrients that are stored in dead organic matter and recycles it so it can be used again. This is apparent when looking at coarse woody debris, such as this tree stump, as well as fine material, like leaves. The importance of decomposition is not only that it releases carbon into the atmosphere, but it recycles it and nutrients in order to make it available again for plant use. There's a balance between decomposition and production that's important to understand for ecosystems. Small changes in this balance between decomposition and production could greatly alter the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere, and therefore the rate of climate warming. If changes in the environment were to increase decomposition globally, the amount of carbon dioxide leaving ecosystems and entering the atmosphere would greatly increase, and the rate of climate warming would increase also. The focal issue that the authors would like you to focus on is that the management of carbon sequestration of the biosphere amplifies human impacts on climate change. Since we know that carbon dioxide is an important greenhouse gas, carbon sequestration, the storage of carbon in ecosystems, is an important way that humans impact climate change. So we impact climate change by releasing CO2 directly into the atmosphere through fossil fuel consumption, for example, but also we affect the way that carbon stores above ground and below ground are decomposed and released into the atmosphere too. And these fluxes are very large. The capacity of natural ecosystems to sequester carbon is generally degraded when lands are cleared for agriculture. Soils are one of the most important repositories for carbon that we have worldwide. And when we alter the vegetation of ecosystems and switch them from natural ecosystems into agricultural lands, often their ability to store carbon is reduced. The authors give the example of land use change in tropical forests. Tropical rainforests sequester substantial carbon in their biomass and also in their soils. And many of these rainforests have been cleared to grow oil palm, which is used as a food product, which we talked about before, and a source of biofuels. The loss of this potential to sequester carbon has a big impact on climate. So these forests over here are storing carbon in their biomass. That biomass is recycled and carbon is released into the atmosphere, but there still is a relatively large pool in the vegetation and in the soils. When we clear native rainforest in order to produce oil palms, the amount of carbon that we're storing in this oil palm is a lot less than what was here in the rainforest. The reason that many of these oil palm plantations are planted is to produce bioethanol or a biofuel. The loss of the potential to sequester carbon due to clearing of rainforests is greater than the climatic benefits due to the substitution of bioethanol for fossil fuels. So essentially what the authors are saying is that the amount of carbon that we lose by switching from a native rainforest to a plantation of oil palm more than offsets the savings that we get in using the oil that's produced from the oil palm instead of fossil fuels. Extensive development of oil palm plantations is really a policy-driven approach, and it's not driven by ecosystem ecology or the understanding that we have of how ecosystems work. One of the focal questions really has to, when we think about carbon and decomposition, is what happens to soil carbon when lands are cleared. So we we'll talk about how soils have a large pool of carbon in them. And when we alter the vegetation above those soils, if they release carbon into the atmosphere, we've lost a giant sink for carbon. And understanding what happens to that soil carbon is an important question that causes us to understand decomposition better. Anytime you hold a handful of soil, there's a lot of carbon in there. And all of the black that you see here is organic matter. It's organic carbon that used to be plant material and now is being stored in that soil. Understanding the fate of this carbon in a simple handful of soil is a particularly difficult question, but one of the most important ones we have to answer. How does climatic change influence the net carbon balance of ecosystems? So, when we think about decomposition, we're going to think about how much carbon is in the soil, how much carbon would be in dead material, and how much carbon would be in live material. The net carbon balance of the ecosystems has to do with how much carbon is going into new material that transfers into dead material above ground and below ground, and the decomposition from these materials into the atmosphere. Understanding how changes in precipitation, for example, or warming impact these two different components. So it can impact the rate of photosynthesis, but also the rate of decomposition. And knowing the balance between those two is an important question to understand how climatic change influences ecosystems.